Welcome back to the Dungeon Master's Block, the place where we come to talk about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game. With every conversation, we hope to inspire as many as possible to keep on Dungeon Mastering.
And I'm one of your hosts, DM Derrick, aka How Not to DM.
And I'm your other host, DM Neal, aka Joke Maniac.
And for this episode, we have a very special guest, Jay Africa. I know, Neal, that recently you spent a lot of time on a boat with him. Do you want to talk about that?
I did. Jay is one of the people that is on the D20 cruise. As always, definitely go look that up. Make that a thing that is just wildly successful. It's a cruise and there's D&D, or there's D&D and there's a cruise. It's whatever mix of that you want it to be. But he was a DM last year and a DM this year. And with how active that event is, I felt really bad that I didn't get to know him better in year one, but I got to sit down, share some meals, spend some time with him, and lo and behold, he's awesome. So I said, "Dear Jay, please come onto our podcast."
Yeah, and he came with some really fun topic ideas. The one that we latched onto was narrative forward play. Jay has a real passion for making games narratively interesting, and so we're going to dive a bunch into that as we get into the episode proper.
And he definitely touches on a bunch of different games, so you can tell the breadth of knowledge that he brings to the conversation to say, hey, I've kind of tried everything. This is where I'm at with narrative forward gameplay, especially picking pieces and parts from all sorts of different systems to try and push both like D&D, his love, further into that narrative.
Yeah, I think we've all, at one point or another, tried out some new rules, whether we got them from a different game or we thought of them ourselves, to try to make our games more rich and interesting. So yeah, it's a great place to learn and think of some new ideas, which is what this podcast is all about. So before we head into the episode, though, we got a couple of things to cover. The first thing is our listener survey, which is still live and will be live until the end of this month, unless we decide we want to keep it open for longer. But the giveaway at the very least will be at the end of this month. So in our Linktree, which is linktree.com/DMS_block, we've got a link there to fill out a quick Google form. It's just asking you a couple of questions about what you think about the show, what you like, what you think we could try different, or what you think we could do differently, that kind of thing. We really just want to make the show as good as possible and as applicable as possible to all of you out there. And a couple of lucky winners will be selected at random, live on the show at the end of July or probably beginning of August sometime. And we're going to be sending those two lucky winners $25 of free dice from Adventure Dice, or rather a $25 gift card or code to use. So definitely worth checking out and filling out, because we want to hear from you, but also you could win some free dice.
And of course we have our upcoming mailbag as our 10-year retrospective, and of course we're also coming in ever closer to episode 300. So if you want to get a hold of us and have some of your questions read and answered on air, you can always email us at dungeonmasterblock@gmail.com or hit us up on one of our social media accounts, and hopefully we will see it there.
And last but not least, we've added a couple of affiliate links in our link tree, so you can go check those out if you want to help support Dungeon Master's Block and everything we do here. That's a great way to do it. We've got our Patreon, obviously, and that's really awesome, but our affiliate links are just for those one-off purchases that you might be making. We've got some for DM's Guild and for Drive-Thru-RPG. A lot of people are buying stuff there. We also have our code with our friends at Adventure Dice. So if you're looking to buy some dice, it's great to support smaller stores. Adventure Dice is an indie dice maker, and we love the stuff that they have created. And if you want 10% off from their store, you can get it there.
And last but not least, speaking of Patreon, as with most of our guests, we have a special How Not to DM style interview with Jay, and you can go check that out on the Patreon at all tiers right now.
Perfect. With all of that out of the way, I know it's a lot, but the show has been around 10 years. We've done a lot of cool things, so we got to cover a lot of cool things. Anyway, with all of that stuff out of the way, let's head to the meat.
I'm starving. We ain't had nothing but maggoty bread for 3 stinking days.
Why can't we have some meat?
The plate meat's back on the menu, boys.
So today for the meat, we have a very special guest, and it is my ever progressing quest to have all of the great people that I meet in person when I go somewhere onto the podcast. And we're checking another name off of the list because we have Jay Africa, game master, RPG author and streamer, graphic designer, designer for the stage, and my favorite in your bio, dad. Jay, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So as always, we get into, I know a lot of answers to this question, and I'm excited to ask it to you to see what you share. But what's something you could tell us and our listeners that you think that they would be interested? Your long walks on the beach, whatever comes to mind.
Well, I'll tell you what, let me start by saying I'm, as you mentioned, a TTRPG designer and pro GM based in Los Angeles, California. I was originally born in the Philippines, moved to the United States when I was about 14, and I got introduced to role-playing games when I was about 11, and this was during the height of the Satanic Panic, which is why it's incredible that a friend of mine in my Catholic school was able to bring the D&D Red Box to school one day and just completely changed my life. I fell in love with role-playing games after that. I dove into playing, a variety of genres. Then, because TSR was, then they weren't just publishing D&D, they were publishing sci-fi like Star Frontiers and Marvel Superheroes, and a bunch of other niche little titles as well, like Indiana Jones, Top Secret. Top Secret was a favorite of mine, Gamma World especially. I moved to the States, and that kind of opened up a world of RPGs because they were frankly pretty hard to come by in the Philippines when I was growing up as a little kid. There were just a select few stores, and usually those stores held a pretty limited amount of products. They were pretty much limited to, old TSR stuff. So when I moved to the United States, I got introduced to things like FASA and Palladium, GURPS, Steve Jackson games, all those games. And that was amazing. That was like another world, like just blossoming out for me. I took a break from TTRPGs in the late 90s and early 2000s, mostly due to going to college and not having time because of the work that I was doing there. But I got back into RPGs in the 2010s when the D&D 4th edition Red Box was released, and I just completely fell in love with that. Yes, 4th edition stalwart over here. Up until then, I was a pretty casual player. I guess my career in RPGs began when I was assigned as the Dungeons & Dragons Adventurers League local coordinator for one of my communities out here in Los Angeles. And, that's when I really started GMing for cons and doing a lot of public games. And I felt like that was really when I started kind of honing my skills as a dungeon master and GM. And then later on, I became a regional coordinator. Our regional coordinator for the West Coast stepped down, and I stepped up into that position. And that's where I first got my foot in the door towards RPG writing. As a regional coordinator, we got opportunities to write material for the D&D Adventurers League. And so I wrote a couple of backgrounds for a supplement for the, I believe it was the Curse of Strahd season. And from there, I got noticed by a couple of folks on writing teams for the then developing community-created content program. These folks reached out to me. I started writing Adventures League adventures for various cons around the nation, and those were released on the DMs Guild. And I've been writing D&D adventures since, and since then. I've also joined writing teams for a couple of other, another role-playing game in particular called Carbon Gray. I was one of the writing team for that. That was a great project. And I now do layouts for adventures, graphic design, cartography. I've got a bunch of, Adventures League titles to my name. And I've got a couple of IPs that I can't quite talk about yet, but I'm very, very excited to work on. Just signed a couple of contracts recently, and I cannot wait to reveal the news about that to the rest of the world.
That's awesome.
So, Jay, is there anything currently that you're working on that you can tell us about?
Oh, yeah. I'm currently laying out a couple of Tier 4 Dungeon Craft adventures for the Adventurers League. Cool. Those will be released in July to coincide with the convention. They're premiering at Conquest Ventura out here in Southern California. And so I'll be running games there. Actually, I'll be running tables of that adventure there, or those adventures, rather. There's two of them. And so those are kind of the big ones that I'm trying to get across the finish line right now. But I've also got a series of additional Dungeon Craft adventures for again, the Adventures League that I'll be putting out on the DMs Guild, hopefully over the next few months as the summer progresses. And beyond that, I'm always kind of running games around Los Angeles. I just recently ran Table of Fate for the Octavia E. Butler Parables Convening event at the LA Public Library Central Branch to celebrate, the fact that the author's works, the Parable of the Sower, started taking place in 2024. And it's this sort of dystopian, blasted hellscape that takes place in Los Angeles. And it was just very interesting kind of being in a room full of players familiar with those books at the day and age that we are now. Like, technically, we were supposed to be there by now, and I feel like we're only a few years off. So, there was some catharsis, I guess, kind of running that game.
It's like when I watched, I can't remember exactly which one it was, but I think it was Godzilla. It was one of the Godzilla movies where they end up like in the main battle is in Fenway Park. I just so happened to watch this movie when I'm in Boston for a work conference, and I had just been in Fenway the night before, and then I was in this theater in Boston. And I was like, this is a lot. This is a lot to sit in the city that I'm just in, watching it get destroyed on this giant screen. So yeah, it's a very specific vibe that you rarely get to feel. But if you can capture it, that one is, that's why a lot of people will do like a zombie setting in their own town. I know a lot of people,
right.
You transfer and like all the bad stuff happens and you're literally like, okay, well, where are you going to go? The elementary school's over here. And so, yeah, those games are a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Big fan of running in like real life settings.
So you mentioned, Jay, growing up in the Philippines, it was kind of hard to find a lot of this nerdy stuff. Have you been back since to kind of see the blossoming of the nerd culture there? I know it's definitely very vibrant now.
Yeah. Well, the last time I was back, it was pre-pandemic. I think it was 2015, 2016, around then. And back then, beyond, like, first of all, D&D 5th edition was, really on the rise, and it was getting incredibly popular. I mean, not quite as popular as it is now, but it was certainly growing. And so there was a pretty strong gaming scene out where I was, which was Manila and the general, the cities around it. It was a lot easier to find that kind of thing. So yeah, I did get to see how it's grown, how it's growing. And I'm part of a few Facebook groups of gaming communities in the Philippines. And I mean, there's just such a big variety of games that are being played out there now, which just warms my heart.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of actually Filipino authors that are beginning to enter the game space as well, which is fantastic. We've got a lot of perspectives that are beginning to, get explored in RPGs, and in a lot of different ways too, beyond just like the mythology and the folklore that we've seen in high fantasy role-playing games. Like Filipino cuisine is being explored in RPGs now, and just kind of like the various aspects of Filipino history, and that's just fascinating to me.
Yeah, I had some friends in the Manila area doing an actual playing through some of the Sina Una stuff, and they were having a ton of fun with it. They really enjoyed it. So yeah, that was cool to watch.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah, wonderful.
If I can get some lumpia in a game, I'm down. Let's be honest with each other. Or just have someone bring it to my game. I'm super good with that too. Dear players, come on, get it together.
I love it.
So we have a surprise question. I feel like my surprise question has just become an immediate DM advice question. I think I feel like I'm going to open a can of worms here, and that's okay. Because I think you're going to give a great answer, and that's why I'm like, oh, get ready. So after running so many games, like what is like your number one piece of advice for someone specifically running con games? Because I always look at the two things as being very different, because when you sit at your home game, like you become better at being the DM for your group. It's a very different thing than becoming a DM for the cruise, a DM for a conference, or even just someone who consistently runs at your local library, not sure who's going to show up. And even to the sense of, and I think this will transition us into our topic, but the idea that like I can be the best DM for my home table and also not be very good for a lot of other people because I've honed my skills to adapt so specifically to the set of players I know I'm going to get every single time I sit down at the table. So I'm trying to context the question to also have the listeners think about this kind of thing. But like, what is your number one piece of advice for someone who is going to run at a con of some kind?
I have a couple. The first one that comes to mind, and this is applicable to all game leadership, right? The first one is listen to your players. Be really open, be really able to listen to your players and hone in on what each one is looking for. And with that in mind, be ready to have various play styles in your pocket. And so if you're a primarily RP DM, practice DMing combat. If you're primarily a combat DM, practice DMing role-playing. And just, keep on honing your improv skills. I feel like that's kind of the big answer that a lot of DMs would give. What my sort of personal bit of advice I would give to con DMs, like if you're DMing at a con, I'm going to assume that you feel comfortable running a public game for other players, right? Know how to end your game. Like, know how to end the narrative of your game. That's my biggest tip to DMs running games at a con, because generally you'll get one shot, right? It's a one shot. It's not a continuing campaign. You don't have all the time to play emotional beats or really just tailor the narrative to your players. So have a bit of narrative ready in your head so that you can send that game off on a really positive note, on a really, like, if not positive, then maybe like an emotional or meaningful note, right? I've found that in public games, the way you end a game has so much more impact than the way you begin a game, because that's the last thing the players will hear from your table. And so usually, whether the scenario ends well, or there's a complication, or whether it's just a complete disaster, I'll have some form of narrative to just bring the characters out of it, end the story, tie it up nicely for everybody. And that is my biggest bit of advice that I can offer you regarding that.
I like it. It's different than what I've heard from other people talking about running con games, but also still very applicable.
It makes me think of like all the shows that you watch where you're just like, and season 5, hot garbage. And like, that's all you end up talking about is just like how frustrated you were that you went on this journey only to have like the rug ripped out from underneath you at the very end. And you're like just super disappointed by that sort of thing. I mean, I realize when I ask these kinds of questions, the theory is that all of us will answer it. So I think mine is also, and this is a personal thing, because when I started doing it, I was not as comfortable with this. And so I guess that's also, give yourself some grace is a huge one, but that's not really my big piece of advice. That's a big piece of advice for just DMing or anything where you put yourself out there and you're going to then have to get feedback from someone else. So give yourself some grace in that regard. The other thing is, if there's something that like, if something kind of flags in your mind as like something that someone says, something that someone does that seems like it may create any kind of uncomfortable moment at the table, just deal with it immediately. You just don't have time to let that linger into something more. Everything kind of needs to be addressed with a timetable in mind of if something feels weird, if it's even like a combat, like you're saying, is the combat going weird? Okay, what's a narrative way that I can work myself out of it quicker? Is this exploration going weird and it's just taking them too long? Is one player saying something that seems like it may be offensive or whatever to another player? Step in. Like, none of these things have the time to linger except for after the game, kind of like you're mentioning. So if something weird happens and you just never address it, it probably will just not come up again. But then that's also what the person walks away with. That weird feeling is what they'll probably think about after the game is done.
I like it too.
Yeah, great piece of advice.
The last time I was running con games was just this spring, and I forgot my dice. So don't forget your dice. That was really annoying. I had to go buy overpriced con dice, even though I have so much at home.
Oh no!
And then when I am prepping con games, I really try to like distill down the whole adventure that I have read into the 2 or 3 key main points or things that need to happen. And then I try to just make sure that I hit those, and then everything else can happen or not happen or whatever. So I try to be as flexible as possible with con games. Yeah, I feel like that's my advice is in your prep, identify the most key things that need to happen and then don't worry about anything else. When it's your home game, you can take 5 minutes and take a break and have your players go do something else. Or you can distract them with filler episodes, filler sessions or whatever when you need to. But with con games, it's the stuff's got to happen, and so I make sure that I hit the key story points or whatever it might be, and then the rest of it I am just as flexible as possible in skipping it or fleshing it out, whatever needs to happen to make it all work and end in the time frame that I've got.
Huge shout out to everybody that runs AL games or Pathfinder Society or anything that kind of has a really set structure. Because one of the things about those is you gotta be done because they need to. I mean, depending on how structured that particular area is and how invested the players are in that structure, like you gotta be done. They need to get their experience points. They need to get whatever boons maybe they're coming away from. They need to get whatever magic items they're supposed to get from this, or even from a narrative development. Like they want to complete this because it is part of the track that is that current season.
Mm-hmm. Or it's an epic and they have to complete objectives in order to get to the next spot or whatever. Yeah, I'm constantly compressing or expanding stuff because I have to. Oftentimes when I'm running Adventure League stuff, it's stuff that would take my home group like 3 sessions or more to go through because they would try to, look under every rock and, talk to every person, and you have to keep it moving.
Which is also the benefit of getting an AL track and bringing it to your home table, because that thing that would have been like 20 sessions just turned into the next 7 years at your home table.
It's true. It's true. It could take them forever.
Yep.
Which I think that's a really good segue, because it shows all of that advice really starts to speak back to the topic that Jay, you wanted to bring forward. Play on words. We'll just roll with it. It's fine. Where we wanted to talk about narrative forward gameplay, which I think is definitely become a much more prevalent way to play games, especially if you've spent any time in the like indie RPG scene, which anymore, that's a whole personal hang up that I just realized I have right now. I don't even like the term anymore. It just is. It's awesome stuff. Like it's all good. And typically it's developed to a degree that is like on par with just any large company, because the way that we have access to, layout and editing and software and print on demand and all of these things, like the quality of RPGs has just like risen to a level that I would have never expected. If you want to say third party RPG content, and like if you look at Fate, you mentioned that, what a different system that is so narrative. And I had some friends play the Star Wars RPG with the Genesis system, super narrative forward once you understand the dice, which is really difficult, but once you get that dice, it's such a great game. So our big question is like, what, just kind of kick us off, is like, what drew you to the topic of wanting to discuss narrative forward gameplay?
What drew me towards it was really trying to figure out what makes a narrative forward game. Because I'm currently playtesting the Critical Role / Darrington Press RPG Daggerheart. And there was a lot of talk about how narrative forward that game is. And it was the same thing when Avatar Legends was released, actually. Mm-hmm. That was based off PBTA, Powered by the Apocalypse. Uh-huh. And there was also a lot of talk about how that was going to be a very narrative-forward game. And diving into them, I found that they were actually super crunchy. There's a lot of crunch to them. I was particularly surprised by Avatar because, PBTA it relies on moves, right? It uses moves, character moves, GM moves. And Avatar had this huge set of moves based on the combat system, or that applied a lot to the combat system.
And each of the different playbooks you chose from, you could have a certain set of moves from them. It was kind of hard for me to grasp as well. Not hard for me, but it took more of my brain power than I expected reading through the book from a game that was supposed to be really narrative focused.
Yeah, and I feel currently actually the same way about Daggerheart. Mm-hmm. And so really what I want to explore, I guess the thing about narrative forward, right? It's such a key word, such a buzzword for games now, and a lot of games are kind of touting themselves as that. It's a feature nowadays, whereas before it was probably more of a concept, and now games kind of want to be narrative forward. A lot of games want to be narrative forward. And I kind of just want to talk about what that means and how games succeed in that, maybe how they fall short, I suppose. I've put some thought on the topic, but again, a lot of this is going to be coming out here. So bear with me if my brain has to kind of like do the spinny wheel, thinking / buffering thing.
No, you're good. Hey, one of the recent episodes that we ended up just literally naming it DM Catharsis Hour. So like, we're not opposed to like an open freeform conversation, because it's like you said, there have been quite a few times on the podcast where I have openly stated, like, I have not come to this conclusion until this moment. Like this, the active conversation that is happening is like the reason I am able to think of the things I have. And my literal first thought is the most narrative forward games I've ever played usually are on one piece of paper.
Right? Yeah.
And once you have a rule book that is 100, 200, 300 with supplements, it's interesting how narrative forward that could possibly still be, unless you're just giving me that much lore. But then you're also not really, are you really then guiding me on the process of keeping that narrative forward? The most narrative forward game I can think of are Dadlands and Jason Statham's Big Vacation, because they're just on one piece of paper and it's just prompts to talk about your character and how it's engaging with the world. And that's kind of it. There are roles, basic roles, but a pass or a fail just moves the narrative forward.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's immediately where my head went, was like the most narrative conversation games I've had are usually like a one-page rule kind of thing.
Yeah, I agree. I was actually revisiting some of the GM Showcase podcast, and I came upon the Terrible RPG episode.
Yes.
And I mean, that's like a character is 6 phrases or 6 ideas on a piece of paper, and that's it,
Yep.
And then everything else is just how you tell the story based on how your tears come out.
I will quickly explain this concept. Your character sheet is a normal piece of paper, and you write down 6 things on that piece of paper. And what you can do when you want to use a move is you grab once and tear. And if you go through where that the word is that you want to use, then you can use that skill. But also you could accidentally like tear way too much off, or you could mess up, and so then your final move is you crumple the paper and you throw it at whoever's running the game. And if you hit them, like, you get your final move off. And so then it also forces you from like that narrative perspective. If your rip goes too far and potentially takes away a skill that you didn't even use, now you have to think more about like, okay, what skills do I have remaining that I can use in the scenario that I have now found myself in?
Yeah. It's a wonderful game. Re-listening to that episode kind of just brought back how much fun it is, and I really want to try to run a session of that just somewhere.
I definitely also now really want to run a session of that. I usually don't dodge. I let him hit me. I'm just like, you're at the point where it's fine. Just use your last move.
Yeah, totally. Right.
I'm trying to work my way up to like the like really, really complicated systems from like the one-page rule. Like, what's my stepping stone between the two? Because I think of PTBA powered by or PBTA. There it is. I don't know. Go to the PTA. It'll be fine too. But but like even that conceptually is really interesting, because a lot of those, like, I'm not rolling as the dungeon master equivalent. So like it forces me to be really narrative forward, because that's kind of the only metric I have. I can still call for rolls and things like that. Is that my place to start? Is it that I try and roll less if I'm running a game?
That's kind of a tricky question, because you do sort of need the guide rails of roles, right, to make sure the story doesn't necessarily go, like players or GMs don't run away with the story and things kind of don't get out of hand, on one side of the screen or the other. Thinking about stepping stones from the one-page RPGs, like for me, Fate is a huge. That's one of my favorite game systems. Super narrative focus, because characters can kind of be anything. right? You don't have specific abilities that necessarily define what a character is. I mean, you do have some of that, but you have room for your room to describe and to expand on who your character is, personality-wise and story-wise, and those are kind of all important to the gameplay. Let's see. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the West End Ghostbusters system, that's also like the character sheet is an index card. You could fit everything in an index card, and that comes with stats and skills that define your character. But beyond the stats, the skills are also pretty open-ended. And so you can kind of define what they are. They're not just dodge, athletics, intimidation. They're things like, play the stock market or haphazardly mix chemicals, like that kind of thing. And so that gives you, it's pretty great. I really love that game too. Fate and Ghostbusters, those are my go-to systems for like system agnostic stories. So if I'm not playing within the world of Dungeons and Dragons or Call of Cthulhu or or Star Wars, for example, I'll usually go to those games because you can dive into the story, get rolling. One of the things about those games is that you're not necessarily required to create everything about your character ahead of time. You can add details, like mechanically effective details to your character as you play. And so I think that's also a really sort of key element, is giving your players room, giving your players space to affect the narrative that way, by letting their characters tie into the narrative specifically that way. That all, like when I talk about this and when I talk about it now, it almost feels like, I'm talking DM 101, right? Or GMing 101. Because a lot of what's kind of pushed in various schools of thought in GMing is, giving your characters room to contribute to the narrative in the middle of play. So in D&D, you're not just walking through the dungeon and encountering everything that's there, and the DM basically knows what's all there, and the players respond to that. But walking through the dungeon and giving it to the players, hey, so what is one thing that your character sees in this room that they recognize? And then they have to come up with something on the spot there. Some games are certainly more geared towards that than others. And so I think that's sort of where the heart of what where a narrative focused game lies. How much agency does it give to players and game masters to kind of, create things based on the story that everybody wants to tell. Ideally, every role-playing game does that, right? But that's not necessarily the case.
I like the giving your players some constraints when you're asking them to kind of help fill in the blanks. Not that most tables would do this, but there's always a fear of new DMs, GMs to not give their players any control because they're going to just use it against you, and they're going to destroy things, or they're going to try to become overpowered by giving themselves whatever they want. But I feel like that's a good kind of place to start, is like, what do you notice in this room that you recognize, or any kind of constraint that you could give them, but still giving them some kind of narrative control. That's a great kind of stepping stone into that.
I love the fear that you just planted there. Like, what do you see in the room that you recognize? Well, I'd know a +5 Holy Avenger anywhere. There it is.
Yeah. Exactly.
Right,
precisely. Yeah. Oh, there's a magical chest that's free of traps, and inside is that MacGuffin.
Yeah. And I get that. And But I think part of the key to the narrative forward piece, and Derek, you had mentioned it, and I know, Jay, you've alluded to it as well, is like, okay, what are the things that have to be there? What are the things set in stone for your story? And it shouldn't be everything, because then that, that's not really going to the conversation. But is it a certain MacGuffin that they eventually need to find? Is it a certain person that they eventually need to talk to? But then start thinking of, how true is that? Okay, is it really that MacGuffin, or is it something that the MacGuffin does and theoretically anything can be that MacGuffin? Is it that NPC, or is it the information that NPC has and the random NPC that they inevitably are going to attach themselves to? Is there anything stopping that now being the NPC that has that? Because that's the narrative they're trying to give to you, is we're really invested in this fry cook that you just randomly threw at us. And now we only want to eat at this one person's food stand or whatever. Every single time we ever play this game, we're going to go there. Like, start making that person more important. Start like, that's that narrative feedback, that feedback loop of like, okay, well, you keep going to this person. I have this important piece of information that you need to obtain from an NPC. I guess it's this NPC now because I know where you're going to go. You're going to go back to this, this person's food stand every single time.
Yep. Yeah. So like, what is the function that I need this person to fill? Right. That kind of thing.
And I know it's a piece of advice that like I like giving, but I also know it's a piece of advice that is difficult to implement because it is asking to some degree game design. And I don't want to say that as a big scary thing. I want to say that as a thing that you're already doing. Dear DM out there, it's a thing you are already doing. Every time you sit down at a table, you are doing some level of game design. That is just true. Is it because you want to fudge a roll a little bit one way or the other? Because you think, again, narratively, it would benefit the monster to die in the next round? Could it be because this fight has been going on for too long? Or could it be that it's, you want to push it one more round because things went too quickly? Is it that they go down the left path and it doesn't matter and left or right, the old quantum ogre situation? Like you are doing game design every time you sit down. So adding more game design to your plate it's inevitably what you're going to do. But like finding those pieces from the games that we're kind of talking about and figuring out what elements of that you can push forward, even if it's just basic concepts of, okay, well, my thing is, and I'm not great about it, but I want to be better. There you go. Do as we say, not as we do. But I want to be better about partial failures or partial successes, even when it comes to D&D. And I'm not great about thinking, okay, you got a 12 and I told you the DC was 14. Do I just be like, okay, and then we just move? Or do I say, okay, but you do succeed in climbing this, but you have a disadvantage on your next attack because you overexerted yourself, or you give it, you passed it so well, you give advantage to the next person. Like what are narrative ways that I can start layering in partial successes, partial failures, which I'm just picking up from Powered by the Apocalypse in the first place?
Let's see. It's interesting that you mentioned sort of the idea of D&D because D&D sort of got that pass-fail, like you said, right? There's not necessarily degrees of success.
It's very binary.
Yeah, exactly. Which is certainly something that I like about Fate and Powered by the Apocalypse and the Kids On series, actually. Kids on Bikes, Kids on Brooms. They have this general degree of success ladder scale that you can capitalize on when telling the story so that your players don't get stuck, right? I think a step towards incorporating narrative forward play to that situation, Neal, where you're climbing something, for example, and then a player fails, say, the athletics check to climb, to scale a wall. I think thinking about how trying to figure out ways to not apply mechanics to it is certainly a way to do it. So you're climbing a wall, you fail, you don't necessarily fall down, you make it up to the wall, but maybe an NPC or even another character that you're with kind of starts to think, oh, hold on, if you can fail this task, how do I feel about that? And how does that color that NPC or the world's view of the character? I think that's certainly one way to do it.
Mm.
And it's interesting. For me personally, like coming at it from a game designer's perspective, I do see a lot of, actually, not just as a designer, but as an editor, I see a lot of pass-fail conditions in like the D&D modules that I read and edit that don't give the DM any guidance as to what happens if you fail, right? If they, a lot of times characters go into this space, they succeed on perception check and notice this detail, right? And this detail affects the game further down the line this way, but it doesn't necessarily give you guidance as to, well, what if the dice are really against them and they all roll nat ones on their perception checks and don't notice that detail? Then what, and that's often the first bit of advice I'm going to, I push forward when I edit is, like what's a way that you can make this check more meaningful beyond just the fail state? And I think even if the consequence is story related, that's better than it just being a fail state.
Kind of in the same vein, but taking a step back, when you are planning maybe individual sessions or you're planning new games that you're going to run, what's the best way you have found to kind of make sure that you're focusing on the narrative as well as whatever kind of mechanics you're playing, and kind of how you would suggest other people go about it, so that we're all focusing on what is ultimately the story we're going to tell together?
That's a tough question, because I don't know if I've necessarily ever fully examined myself that way. I'm a big fan of like evocative setting of the scene. If you ever read any of my bios anywhere, I consider myself a campfire DM, and so it's like I'm not just necessarily narrating what you see and like what you hear via descriptions. I try to act, I like being evocative, and I like to try to instill like a real feel of being someplace, right? And being in a situation. And I think that's certainly one way to do it. Just put that energy in there, manifest that energy into your games. And so if you describe the wind, don't just describe it like, make that sound effect. Start practicing how you can capitalize on all of your characters, your players' senses. But really, the big thing I've found is I get a lot of players who just say, "Can I make a deception check? Can I make an insight check? Can I make a performance check?" And just pushing them a little bit and saying, "Hey, all right, you certainly can. How do you do it? What does your character do to do it? What does your character say to do it?" I think a lot of games recently, starting with like D&D 3rd edition and going into 4th edition, passed a lot of agency to the characters, or to the players rather, which is great. But I think because so much of that had to do with game mechanics, we just I see a lot of players who just kind of say, "I want to use this mechanic," and not necessarily. Yeah, exactly, and aren't really conditioned or trained or informed that part of playing a role-playing game is that you kind of do tell the story of your character. It's not just a video game where you're capitalizing on mechanics and watching the story unfold around you. Exactly. And so, the biggest thing, one of the things that I like to do as a DM to kind of help players develop their characters, if they're a spellcaster, I'll ask them what their spells look like. I'll say, describe to me what your magic missile. I mean, it can, and it's the same thing. Like you mentioned, Derek, you do kind of give them the guidelines, but you also open it up for them to make their own thing. Now, in the book, it says that they're just points of light that shoot out of your fingers and hit an opponent. It doesn't necessarily have to be just that. What do yours look like? Is your your character? You mentioned earlier in your introduction that they're an astronomer. Does that play into how your spells manifest?
One of the thoughts that came to mind is, like, if this is something that you aren't really doing at your table and you're thinking this is something that I would like to implement, the likelihood that you will need to probably start out attaching it to mechanics is kind of high. Just in the sense that, like, if you're trying to change kind of the way that the game is played at your table, like, there needs to be probably some transition, especially if you're staying within the same rule set. Let's say it's me and I'm playing D&D and I want a more narrative focused setup for my game. I can't, but I have like a super crunchy table. I can't just say, "Okay, we're not rolling anymore, everybody, and we're going to have a great time." Likely that's not going to go very well. But if I start incorporating ideas like, I think a Phoenix Dawn command where you have the mechanic there is called the torch. And basically every time you enter a space where interactions are going to happen, a torch is placed down and there are several things written on the torch that are in the room. And when a person utilizes those, they basically get to me, it's the equivalent of advantage. So one of the key ones is like the first room you enter, there's a giant taxidermied bear. It works for D&D because inevitably someone is going to want to push the bear over on top of something. 9 times out of 10, this is what has happened when I've run this. They want to push the bear over or jump off of the bear or swing from the chandeliers or utilize this torch for extra damage or. But all you did was say, "These things are in the room. What do you do with them?" Or even like going that one step further is, "Here is the torch. Let's talk about some things in the room that you can then utilize when we do this session, and even going around the table, okay, what's something you see, and writing that down. What's something you see? And now you have a direct mechanical effect for creating more of that narrative. Or do you do a really elaborate description for what your magic missiles look like? And I say, you know what, for this time, how about you roll 1d4 plus 2 instead of 1d4 plus 1? Like I said, it's a lot easier to start something differently. It's much more difficult to change what you already have going into something different. So it may be that if you are trying to like have more narrative forward sessions and campaigns, that you will likely need to attach it to mechanics.
I agree with what you were saying earlier, Jay, about like the trying to push players to be more narrative in their approach to playing the game as well, instead of, like you were saying, you know, playing it like a video game where you just use this thing to get the answer. And I kind of find it hard, though. Like, you know, you can continue to ask them to, well, why, you know, how are you doing this, or what are you doing, or why, when they just know that that's what they want. Like, I just want to roll a deception check, so just let me, you know, roll a deception check. So, yeah, have you found like there's any kind of easier way to get them to do that? Is it that, you know, leading by example? Is it just continually asking them until they're conditioned to try to role play it instead of just you know, use the skill? Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, really. and I have actually, you know, it always surprises me, but I have encountered players that just say, you know what, we're here to roll dice. We don't necessarily need all the RP. You know, if you can move past that quickly and get to the combats, that's what we're here for.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know what? It always surprises me. It just catches me off guard. But as someone who DMs in public and for groups that you can't necessarily predict, I mean, it's important. It's part of everyone's job to have fun, to make sure everybody's having fun, right? But of course, obviously, as a game leader, you do feel, I personally feel that a little more strongly in my heart. I want to make sure everybody has a good time walking away from this table.
Right.
You know, you're taking the time to join my table. I'm not just leading the game for you. I want to make sure that you're entertained. But I found that adding little narrative flourishes as a DM, you know, the players, I've never seen, even a table of players that really want to stick to the combat, I've never seen a table say, you know what, you're kind of over describing things and it's slowing things down. You know, let's put that down and let's really just play this as a board game. I've never come up with players who've said that. And generally, if I just kind of keep adding little narrative flourishes, players, you know, they'll walk away, you know, having had a fun time. As far as ongoing tables go, like bringing it up, certainly, like saying, hey, listen, you can make skills all the live, you can make skill checks, you can make, you know, dice rolls all the live long day, but I do want you to attach a narrative to that. I do want to hear what your character is saying. I do want you to describe how your character does this physical feat for me. Certainly bringing that up, you know, before gameplay. But also, like for me personally, I also like playing characters and doing voices. And I find that if I just start talking to people and I kind of engage them that way and immerse them in interactions that way, they're more open and showing that I'm kind of willing to make a fool of myself, quote unquote, you know, or just do like really commit to a role at a table. I find that players are much more open as well to return that sentiment.
I just thought of the person who's like super into the combat, and you're just like, well, so how do you kill him? No, moving on.
Yeah. I reduce him to 0 hit points.
Yeah, it's like, well, that doesn't happen. The person is just like, oh yeah, I do these things.
Yeah.
You're like, yeah. See how fun that was? Like getting described like your interaction with the world is because like it's a term that I've heard recently a couple times where your perception is uniquely yours. Perspective is looking at it from someone else's viewpoint. And if you can switch between the two, like your interaction with the world becomes just better because your perception is yours. Like you can't, you know, the things that made you are why you look at the world differently. And one of, I think, the coolest things about the games that we get to play, especially because we're all kind of doing the same thing and talking about the same world and talking about the same scenario, but also getting to see someone else's perspective. Like that's one of the other, like what I see as one of the key benefits of having a narrative forward game is that I get to be more informed about whatever weird little world I'm playing playing in, because I'm getting to see it potentially from someone else's perspective. And the only way I can do that as the person running the game is to actually ask them enough or set them up enough to be able to engage with me on that same level. It always goes back to the whole thing of just like, okay, that's not what I was thinking at all, but that's 100% what's happening now, and I'm writing it down like it was the thing that I was always going to do. But like, if you're not affording the players enough agency to have that narrative, then you don't get to have those moments of basically just stealing their ideas and acting like it's yours. But like, so like having the moments where like they can share their perception and their perspective, that's the most important thing. And it's just more fun. Like I get it. Like that, I'm saying that as my perspective, is my own perception, is that I have more fun for two reasons. One, I think it's cooler because we have a shared narrative, and two, it's fundamentally less work. If I get the chance to like work with someone rather than doing all the work myself.
Yeah. And I think it's a more satisfying experience for players too. And for me personally as GM, if they're open to like really sharing details and creating those details with me, that gives me more to work with, as a game leader. And it becomes a more personal experience. And so I'm sure that there are a lot of homebrew or, home game GMs out there and a lot of pro GMs out there who kind of are already leading games for very specific groups. And you get the time, again, going from the difference between running a home game and running a con game, you have the time to really develop that and internalize it. You write down your notes about what the players want and what their characters want and what their characters are like. And you have time to craft that throughout the course of your sessions. But as somebody who, say, runs a one-shot in public, that you don't have as much time to do that and give the players sort of that satisfying experience. And that's also one of the things that I do want to be able to convey, or not convey, but I want players who play one-shots to understand that there's a richness that you can bring to an experience, or that you could have within this role-play experience, that is accessible even if you're going to just, if you're going to a con or going to a game day at a local store, at a friendly local game store, and just playing, 4 hours of a scenario. I've seen a lot of players who kind of go and treat it as D&D light, or RPGs light. But if you just lean into the story and lean into the tone of the game, you can have a really great, memorable time. Like you said, Neal, you can, like, every player contributes their perspective to the game. You can have a great time seeing other people's perspectives, adding your own, and it can be, it's obviously not going to be like a continuing story where you're continuing this tale for 20, 50, 100 sessions, and you really kind of develop the meat of the story and the meat of your characters that way. But you can have a very satisfying experience playing, like one session or two sessions or three sessions as well. And that's something, Neal, that you and I obviously certainly had to think about.
Yeah.
Doing that on the cruise, right?
Well, it makes me think of these are two very specific examples because they're the examples in my home. It makes me think about like Ted Lasso. It was so fulfilling because it was done. And then my wife is hate watching season 21 of Grey's Anatomy. Because she's like, I'm too invested. I don't really enjoy this, but I'm going to keep doing it because for some reason they keep doing it. And we're just going to, we're at a standoff here. And I'm just going to keep watching if you keep making it, but you shouldn't keep making it, because you said you were done 4 seasons ago. And yet here we are, renewed for season 21, I believe. So, but those same concepts of like, I'm trying to think of the right words. I think some of the most memorable sessions that I've had are at conventions, but at the same time, some of the most beloved games I have are often campaigns. And like, I can view those in very different lights. Like, my best session I've ever had was at Gen Con 50, playing Blue Planet with Rich Howard. Jeff Barber was running it, who ran the game. Darcy Ross was there. It's like, that was lightning in a bottle in a way that can never be recreated. Like, there's just no chance. It was what it was when it was, and there's nothing that can recreate it. And so it stands out as one of the best single sessions I've ever had. But like I look at that so differently than like my home campaign and like the beloved stories that we've told in some of the things that I've done over the span of years. So like that's definitely the way that I view the two separately.
Yeah, there's certainly something to be said about watching characters grow over multiple sessions and see, you know, kind of looking back when you're done with your campaign or in the middle of your campaign where you kind of at a good stopping point, kind of looking at that first level character sheet and then seeing how they've developed over the course of however many levels you've gone, 5, 10 levels, 20 levels, right? That's one of the things that I like about organized play and the D&D Adventurers League is that you kind of get a sense of that because I have players who have been playing the same character for a number of seasons now. And so it's almost like talking about your kids. Oh, hey, I remember that Dragonborn character of yours when they first, with that first table I played. What have they been up to? Oh, they finally got that Great Axe +3 that they've been looking for, huh? That's awesome, and it's fun doing that too.
So in thinking about homework we can give the listeners in terms of narrative forward play, what are some things that you can think of that you would suggest they go out and try this weekend in their home games or, in any upcoming one-shots or con games they might be running?
Homework. So first of all, be aware of when you're just using the mechanics, right? When a character calls for, again, that insight check or that athletics check. Just pause, or not necessarily pause, but maybe use that as a trigger to pass the torch on to them, as you mentioned, Neal, and say, okay, all right, great. What does that look like? And in a few sentences, you don't have to overexpand necessarily. Sometimes giving players that kind of guideline helps too. Just describe what happens, describe what your character says. Let's talk it out. What does your character say to this NPC? And I'll respond likewise. Like kind of giving them that is certainly one way that you can do it. The sort of corollary to that, by the way, that I didn't get to mention before was just being ready to give a player an out. If the player's a lot more shy than you've anticipated, just saying, if that's something you're not, if you don't have anything to say right now, yeah, we can make this check. If it comes to you, go ahead and mention it. Or I'll respond to it. And if the response comes to you with the response, then, please feel free to bring it up. Again, that goes back to listening as a GM and being aware of what your players really want. And so that's one bit of homework. Just ask that question. Like, what does it look like in the story? How does it sound like in the story? Even like, how does it affect this aspect of the story? Like, how does it affect the NPCs around you? How does it affect the environment if you pass or if you fail this check? Additional homework wise, I would say just if you're used to playing Dungeons and Dragons and you're not necessarily used to other games, like go out and pick a new game. You don't necessarily have to spend money on it. There are a lot of like free one-page RPGs out there, as Neal mentioned. Read it, like pick an adventure, pick a new RPG, and just read through the book. See how it encourages you as a GM to put focus on the narrative, and then see how it gives that narrative to the players. See how it encourages the players to add to the narrative. We've mentioned before, Fate is a great place to start. Fate and its various settings are really great places to start reading about that. PBTA games, those are also a great place to start if you want to look into a system that's very, very different from your classic D20 system. Again, all those one-page RPGs. I'm trying to think of any other games. Oh, the Fantasy Flight Star Wars games. Those are actually really great places to start too, because they have a good chunk of mechanics, but they also tell you, like, they're very good. The manuals are really good at telling you how to think of them within the world of the game first, within the world of the story and the story you're trying to tell. Modiphius's Star Trek system is great at that. And Free League's Tales from the Loop and the corresponding games, those are all wonderful games to kind of like read. You get a sense of the tone of the game, which for me like really helps when you're trying to communicate the narrative to the players.
Yeah, I know for me, I'm definitely going to try to focus more on the consequences of actions coloring the story rather than just mechanics. I think that's a really good tip that I definitely am not very good at and want to get good at. So you and me both, Neal, we'll have to work on that. As far as stuff to read, I feel like you covered a lot of really good games and examples there, Jay. Yeah, I guess I would just suggest, like I said, kind of at the beginning of the episode, even when you're prepping, outline the stuff that's got to happen, and then don't worry about the rest of it, and make sure to leave space for everybody to kind of fill in what's going to happen in the story or the result of things, and that way you're all kind of building it together.
The one I think of a lot is going back to the Adventure League, like those one shots, and kind of looking at those. I mean, oftentimes they're attached directly to like a story. Like season 4 was Curse of Strahd. Is Curse of Strahd something very interesting to you? Go look at the Adventure League like modules, because like they have to work. Like they have to tell a story. Like they are set up to tell a story in a very finite amount of time. And you can take away a lot of like, okay, these have been typically edited, playtested, and like those start to be the second layers. Okay, am I choosing season 4 because of Curse of Strahd? Am I looking through of like which of these are the highest rated? Which of these fits my player level? Which of these? And so there's a lot you can do to kind of like hone down to a specific one that could help you very specifically run your game. And then if not, just grab a random one and see like, okay, so what is something that is like written with the full intent to tell a story essentially from beginning to end within a super finite amount of time, and then just see what you see.
Yeah, take what works and apply them to your own games, right?
Well, perfect. The other question we have is, where can people go out on the old World Wide Web to find all the awesome stuff you're doing?
Oh, yeah. Let's see. So a lot of the work that a lot of the adventures that I've published are on the DMs Guild. So if you just search J Africa on the DMs Guild, you'll see all the stuff that I've done. I'm also on itch.io. I have a couple of items there. One is an adventure that I wrote for a game system called 9 Lives to Valhalla. You play death metal Viking cats, and you go around just raiding carnage and death and gore in the most metal possible way, in this post-apocalyptic world. The system, again, 9 Lives to Valhalla, highly recommend it. That's also super narrative forward because the dice mechanic for that game is kind of insane. I'm not going to reveal it now. If you get a chance to check it out, please do. And I wrote an adventure for it called On Death's Errand. You could find that on itch. And also I have I don't know if y'all were in on the Fishblade game jam that happened
I know,
a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about though.
Yeah. I wrote a game called High Tider, The Fissioning, where you play a fish with a sword, and you have to go around challenging other fish with swords. You gotta slay them in ritual combat and gain their own magical fish energies until there can be only one. That's also up on itch. Check it out. Egregiously unplaytested. I kind of banged that game out in 2 weeks and put it out in the world. So, check it out, give it a read. That's one where it's like, I feel like the tone is kind of aptly conveyed in that game. But you can also find me on all socials. I am Transplant Asian on Instagram, and I am at J Africa, just J Africa, pretty much everywhere else. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter/X, Blue Sky, all those places. And you can also find me streaming every Monday on the Happy Jacks RPG Network on Twitch. We are streaming Outrunners, which is an actual play for a new system called Starscape. That one is PBTA. And actually, that's a really, really great example. Like, if you want to see, like, narrative role-playing and kind of a GM really being open to what the players bring and the players really keying on what the GM brings, I highly recommend that actual play. That happens every Monday evening, 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And we're a group it's a found family sci-fi role-playing game. We're all playing a crew of various life forms, exploring the galaxy and getting into hijinks.
Yeah, you've got a laundry list of stuff you're working on and stuff that you're a part of, so I'm excited to go check it all out. But thanks so much for joining us, Jay. It sounds like you and Neal had a ton of fun on the cruise. I always get a little FOMO when Neal goes on the cruise and tells me about all the great stuff he did and the people he met and how fun it was. So, maybe one of these years I will get myself a boarding pass.
That is a goal. I hope everyone goes on the cruise eventually. I hope the cruise gets big enough that there's 2 cruises, 3 cruises, 4. Just Dr. Seuss the cruise line and just have just all year long. I'm in for it. Jay, are you in for just cruising and playing D&D forever? Perfect.
Absolutely. Yeah. 365 days. Yeah, it's a great life. Red cruise, blue cruise, one cruise, two cruise, I don't know, whatever. But yeah, Derrick, same. Yeah, I hope that you get to make it on one of these days. It is a fantastic experience.
Well, perfect. I know without a shadow of doubt, we will have to have you back on. Who knows what the topic will be next time. And as always, we want to thank Jay for coming on and spending some time with us and sharing his thoughts about narrative forward play. And of course, just like kind of working it out with us and coming up with some new ideas on the spot. And of course, if you have some ideas, especially if you have different game systems that you've kind of taken pieces and parts from and added it to D&D, you can always email us and tell us about that at dungeonmasterblock@gmail.com. And of course, if you see fit and you enjoyed the episode, head over to Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. Leave us a rating and review to defeat the one, the only algorithm.
Gotta get rid of Al. Mm-hmm. And good news with the mailbag episode coming up, that whatever that message is that you're going to send us will probably be read live on the Dungeon Masters block, which would be really fun for us and for you. Yeah, speaking of which, we've got that mailbag episode coming out, so get your questions in, get your comments in, get your stories in. We'd love to read them. We've got the listener survey live. Again, a couple of gift cards going out to people who fill that out for $25 of free dice from our friends at Adventure Dice. And we've got the affiliate links in the link tree, so check those out. We also have an iTunes review.
And today's iTunes review comes to us from DM's Ajax, 5 stars, entitled Great Combo. I followed Derrick over from How Not to DM, and it's great hearing him combine forces with Neal. There's a good dynamic here. Well, you heard it here first. You probably already heard it. If this is your first episode, now you know.
Now you know, yeah. It has been good combining efforts and combining forces with you, Neal, and hopefully the listeners out there think the same thing. But yeah, shout out to my friend, his name is Paul Zajac. If you're ever in the mood for some YouTube content, he's got a channel called Boss Battles where they do some kind of commentary over top of actual plays that they're doing. So it's kind of a fun spin on content that I haven't seen before, doing a breakdown of a DM actually running a game instead of, talking about running games like we do. So yeah, go check it out.
And as always, you can check out other shows like the mentioned in episode, the GM Showcase, Dungeons and Dragons and Daughters, and more.
Thanks for listening to the Dungeon Masters block, the place where we come to talk about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game, the only person capable of playing God,
killing characters,
and lowering the egos of all the people at the table. I'm DM Derrick. May thy knife chip and shatter.
I'm DM Neal. Good night, good luck, and keep on dungeon mastering.
It's not inspiration, it's not wisdom, and it's bad advice.
So if you want to try narrative 2 forward, just read them a story that you wrote.
Ooh, players love that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, and do stuff to their characters in the story, too.
Yeah. I mean, like, what's the point if you're not telling the story that you want to tell?
I had flashbacks. I didn't like it.
Goodbye.